So there's all these people lined up that are witnesses, that can testify, they can whatever. And he said, if it's under 10 million, I probably won't get to it for 10 years.
I know he's invests all over the place, but he does a lot of southern Minnesota. Looks like he did a little problem fudging money for investors, giving them the money to put down when they said they didn't have the money. Did you see that?
And he said pled guilty to bank fraud and forfeited $35.7 million.
Yeah.
He forfeited.
The guy's making tons of money, and I think he worked at the hospital too, I think.
Well, it says there, he's an anesthesiast.
Oh, there we go. Okay. A nurse, anesthetist. Yeah. I heard of this guy. I know he's been on like podcasts and kind of build himself as the way to buy commercial properties and stuff. And he might have done a bunch of deals on his own, and he did well. And now trying to get more deals. And what it sounded like is that he would get the money for the people that were actually doing the bank financing, but not telling the bank. And the bank wants to know that because they think, hey, the person I'm qualifying here is putting in $4 million. And so I'm owing them $8 million. I'm borrowing them $8 million. And then now these guys are doing a note on the side and they have zero into it.
What was the name of his company? I've never, I'm being honest, I've never heard of the guy.
Northwoods Management LLC.
How many properties does he manage?
I know he's done a ton. Okay, yeah, there it was, the $3.25 million. He put that into account of an investor applying for the loan. So you can't defraud the government. You can't defraud loans. You just can't do it. And that'll get you, and I'll bet you any money, there's a bunch of other properties he's got that are probably no problem and they're really good. The guy knows what he's doing, but you start getting into it. It's like, well, gosh, here's what we got to do. Or maybe he was getting away with it forever and finally got caught.
What I was wondering is, you guys have been in the industry for a long time. How common are some of these guys like playing loose by the rules, the big investors?
Andy, tell your story about, did you have the FBI or something to ask you? They can't even go after these people. There's so many of them.
Just to clarify this, so when you say investment properties, yes, it's real estate. This is probably apartment buildings and commercial level 4+ unit kind of investments, I'm guessing. So commercial is played by a whole different set of rules, actually very loose compared to residential, single family, you're buying it to owner occupy. Whole different set of rules, okay? But yeah, back in the day, I did have a real close clip with some of this mortgage fraud stuff that was going on. And I had a couple properties that I walked away from, made sellers sign notes that said that they understand they're committing fraud and that we have no part of it. We've suggested they don't do this, and have everybody sign it, right? And they all signed it and they still closed on these deals. But what was happening, long story short, was there were people coming in with straw buyers and they were set up on, the stated income. They had decent credit scores so they could state their income. They'd buy these properties they couldn't afford. They'd have renters lined up that would actually try to rent the property from them. And then what would happen is the investor at the end of the day was paying the finder a fee. And so a lot of times what would happen was these houses, especially new construction, they were fraudulent and they'd say, okay, here's a Rambler that's $700,000. We're going to buy it for $1 million, but we're going to finish the basement and put on a deck. So we'll close it at $1 million with all of that finished, and you'll pay my remodeling company, $300,000. This was happening all over the Northwest. I mean, you read the papers. It's long ago. But anyway, so at closing, this company would receive a check for $300,000. Where the fraud would happen is that the buyer that came in had no idea what they were doing. They were set up to make a fee, which would be paid at closing. The renters were lined up for a year. They'd give them enough money out of their proceeds to pay the rent for at least 6 months so that the FBI would not be involved. And then so they had all this well calculated. They'd go to the bank, they'd cash a $300,000 check that was being deposited, and it looked legitimate because it was a construction company. So all of a sudden this construction company would get $300,000 minus all these fees, and these guys didn't do a damn thing to this house. And then you'd see that house in foreclosure about a year later because the people couldn't afford after the renter would disappear and the payments weren't being made. So I saw that. Now I'm sitting at a dinner party. I couldn't believe this. I'm sitting there and cautiously says, yeah, this gentleman says I work for the FBI. And I'm like, no way. Before I could even get the word, he goes, I do consumer fraud and we do a bunch of the, like this lending fraud. And I go, oh my God, do I have a story for you? I tell him the whole story. And this is the sad reality. This whole story. And he goes, well, what do you think the value of the fraud was? And I go, I don't know, 300 grand. But I know they did it at least 10 times the same month because the banker, when they went to cash the check with my client, the banker said, wow, this is your 5th one this week. You guys are doing really well. Okay. So there's all these people lined up that are witnesses, that can testify, they can whatever. And he said, if it's under 10 million, I probably won't get to it for 10 years. There's so many other fraud cases out there and so many other, the white collar crimes that are happening. We wouldn't even get to that guy for 10 years. And I go, so what? Then get to him in 10 years. And they're like, well, if you want to start the paperwork, I'm like, oh my God, that may have changed now as now I have the FBI busting my door. But back then there was a threshold. There was so much going on at that time. They didn't have time to investigate this stuff. And so it was, and I say that I don't need the whole world to think that there's a bunch of fraud going on. Now it's a lot different than it was back in 2007, 8, and 9. There was a lot of weird stuff going on back then.